Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to have you all. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Patricia Zurita. I'm the Chief Executive of BirdLife International. And I have the immense pleasure of opening up the first of our conservation series webinars, where we're going to be talking about the bird trade in Asia and what's the situation and how can we tackle it and what are we doing from BirdLife perspective, not only from our team, but from one of our key partners in this process, Burung Indonesia, BirdLife in Indonesia. I have the immense pleasure of introducing our great panel of speakers today. We will have Richard Grimmett, the Director of Conservation for BirdLife International. And then he'll pass it on to Anuj Jain from the BirdLife team in Asia, who is coordinating the bird trade work from our Singapore office. And then we'll have Adi Widyanto from BirdLife in Indonesia, Burung Indonesia, where he will be speaking specifically about the situation in his country. So I am delighted that so many of you have joined so far. We had over 800 people registering, which is extraordinary, and it shows the incredible interest that people have. So we will have these three gentlemen presenting to you, and then we will open up for questions and hopefully have lively and dynamic conversation, hopefully with a lot of suggestions on how to solve it. Without further ado, let me pass it on to Richard Grimmett.
First of all, just a few words about BirdLife International. We're a global partnership for nature and people, 115 conservation partners around the world, with nearly 10 million supporters and members. Next slide, Sarah. So our focus is birds. That's what you would expect. Birds are wonderful ambassadors for nature and excellent indicators of the health of our planet. They are mobile, they are responsive, they are everywhere, they are better studied and known than other taxa. They really are the canary in the coal mine. Next slide. So the presentation today, as you've heard, is on bird trade in Asia. I'll talk about the conservation issue and why it's so topical at the moment, the issue of wildlife trade, the link to health and human well-being. And then we'll talk about BirdLife's response, our overall response, and more specifically, our work on Helmeted Hornbill, on addressing the illegal killing of birds for food and for recreation, and more specifically, again, our work on parrots and songbirds in trade. Next slide, please. And this really is an important issue. 62% of threatened birds in Asia are impacted by hunting and trade. That's over 265 species threatened with extinction because of hunting and trade. Next slide. Now, this is an issue very much in the public mind at the moment. There is an enhanced global concern about trade in wildlife due to the current COVID-19 pandemic. There are strong concerns about the link between the pandemic, the outbreak of the pandemic in Wuhan, and the illegal trading of wildlife in a wet market in that city. There's also a very strong consensus building that this virus has originated in bats, or originated from bats, and the transmission is linked to the trade in and the use of bats, wild caught bats, through markets in China. Now, next slide. The current crisis is only 17 years on from SARS, and that was also believed to have originated from trade in wildlife. So we had been warned, and it really is now time to do something about it. Bird flu is another area for considerable concern. It represents a major threat to human health, and as an issue is a further reminder of the dangers of trading and mixing wild and domestic birds. This map shows the documented infections in humans during the first 10 years of this century from avian influenza. And it is widely believed that Spanish flu was a bird flu, and that killed over 50 million people at the end of the First World War. So we really do have to change the way we use and we treat wildlife, and we have to change our impact on the natural world. And this is so important and now increasingly recognized as being critical for a healthy planet. Next slide. Now, there are three dimensions to the trade in birds in Asia. We're going to be talking about those today. First is the trapping and trade of birds for ornamental products, such as here, the cask of Helmeted Hornbill. We'll be talking about that a little bit later in the presentation. The trade, the hunting and trade of wild birds for food and for recreation. This picture shows a trapper in northeast India with a large number of recently caught Amur falcons for food. And a third dimension, a very important dimension, is the trade in wild birds for the cage bird trade because of their beauty and their wonderful singing. Next slide. Now, keeping cage birds is popular across many countries in Southeast Asia. We do need to recognize that. It's been said, for example, that there are more birds in Javan households than in the wild. It's a deep-rooted cultural practice. In Indonesia, it's said that to truly be a man, to be contented, you should have a house, a wife, horses or transport, a weapon and a bird. And I've heard it said that keeping a bird in a cage is safer than in the forest. And of course, there is a little bit of truth in that. The problem is that birds are being loved to extinction. We are facing an extinction crisis. Next slide, please. So BirdLife's response, it's fourfold. Firstly, we are protecting sites and the species threatened by trade at those sites. We are establishing safe havens where we are protecting birds from trapping and trade, engaging with enforcement agencies and local communities. We are putting in place a sound science foundation for our work, an understanding of the scope and scale, the species involved, the markets, the trade routes, to ensure that we're well prepared, we understand well the situation, and that enables us to engage with the global and national policy agenda and to influence policy, regulations, and legislation. It means that BirdLife has a strong position and a strong voice on this issue. We're also working on the supply chain and monitoring the trade in birds, the routes, through market surveys, through mapping traders and sellers online, making sure we know who's doing this, and working with organizations like Traffic to inform the enforcement agencies in the key countries. And then lastly, the fourth component to our strategy, the longer term agenda, of course, is behavior change and demand reduction. And that's work that Burung Indonesia is undertaking at the moment. So those arrows show where we are already very active, or indicate where we're active. Sorry, the ticks show where we're active and already working. The arrows show where we wish to step up, and we are seeking your support in order to do so. So I'm going to, next slide please. I'm going to hand over now to Anuj, who is going to talk to you about the regional dimension to the work of BirdLife. Thank you very much, Anuj.
Thank you, Richard. Anuj here, dialing in from the BirdLife Asia office in Singapore. And today I'm going to tell you about the plight of this extraordinary bird, the helmeted hornbill. Standing at over a meter tall, this is one of the largest hornbills in Asia, and also now one of the rarest. It is the only hornbill in the world with a solid helmet-like casque found in both males and females. These birds engage in aerial casque butting contests, if you will, to fight for precious food and territory. And in doing so, create these loud clacks that can be heard in the forest floor, often more than 100 meters away. Quite a sight to hear and see, if you can find one. However, it's this, the bird's big helmet-like casque that is leading to its demise. Despite it being a completely protected species, it is being hunted to extinction in parts of Southeast Asia, where it's found from Myanmar to Borneo. As a result, it is now listed as critically endangered. The casque for the hornbill has been in great demand for carved jewelry and ornaments for now many centuries, mainly by emperors of China. But with rising wealth, the demand has exploded in the middle class to completely unsustainable levels. Depending on the quality of the carvings and the casques, the products can now fetch more than $1,000 in the black market. Organized crime networks are now involved, particularly in Indonesia, but possibly elsewhere as well. So in 2017, more than 30 different conservation organizations came together to develop a conservation plan and strategy to save the species. A year later, the action plan was put forth and adopted by the IUCN. BirdLife co-led the process and now co-coordinates the Helmeted Hornbill Working Group. The action plan lays out key steps needed to reduce demand for the species, tighten the trade, as well as strengthen ongoing protection for the species. It may come as a surprise, however, that until recently, we had huge knowledge gaps about the hornbill's distribution and population declines. So BirdLife, using its strength of site-based work, identified priority sites using predictive distribution models, which are not shown here for as a precautionary measure. Then we conducted field assessments to really identify the gap areas where these birds may be found and quantify baseline populations. Here are some photos from the field in Indonesia and Malaysia of partners working the ground, conducting hornbill population surveys as well as habitat surveys, connecting closely with local communities. Using all this, we went ahead to identify safe havens for these birds. These are really large areas, typically greater than 500 kilometers squares, where the birds are known to breed and reside at high population density, and where threats are mitigated and managed. We went further to then secure 4 safe haven sites where we have essentially managed to and are working towards managing these sites in a way that are relatively hunting free, so we can secure long-term strongholds and safe havens for the helmeted hornbill and other important hornbill species. To do so, we've identified locations to target anti-poaching efforts, build capacity for effective enforcement, and work closely to engage and empower local communities, such as the Orang Aslis here that work with us as hornbill guardians to safeguard hornbill nests in peninsular Malaysia. Now, moving on, the other issue that is often overlooked and poorly understood in Asia is the illegal killing and trade of birds for food. In comparison, the hunting of wild mammals for food and cage bird trade is much better understood. The issue becomes complicated because part of the hunting is for subsistence, while others are for delicacy and selling to local restaurants and eateries, and sometimes even for sport. A case in point are the Amur Falcons in India. These migratory raptors pass through India in their annual journeys from Siberia to Africa in what are believed to be the largest raptor migrations anywhere in the world. Local communities and hunters opportunistically were observed to catch over 120,000 birds annually for food as delicacy and trade in Nagaland in 2012. And the proportion of the trade was huge, significant to impact global populations and therefore of conservation concern. So BirdLife, our local partner, BNHS, Bombay Natural History Society, and other partners on ground intervened and have managed to successfully end the massacre by raising awareness, strengthening local protection, and developing alternative livelihoods, largely through ecotourism initiatives for visitors to come and enjoy this migration spectacle. This couldn't be possible without the support of local communities and their stewardship. And truly, Naga people have turned from hunters to protectors. They now welcome the Amur Falcons. The elders have banned hunting, and they celebrate as these raptors come in large numbers at their sites. And we can now proudly say that now up to 1 million Amur Falcons pass by the Doyang Reservoir, an important bird and biodiversity area in India, unharmed every year. Well, until recently. COVID-19 has thrown up new challenges for ecotourism, and we need to scale up our efforts to figure out new ways to support communities and make sure they have an alternative source of income. In Southeast Asia, the extent of this problem is also believed to be very large, but largely unquantified. So building on BirdLife's past assessments in the Mediterranean and Europe region, we've launched a Southeast Asia-wide situation analysis to understand and quantify the extent of killing of birds for food. Our partners have worked with local stakeholders, conducting community interviews, visiting markets to identify the scale, locations, and the reasons for hunting and killing across 10 Southeast Asian countries. This is a work near completion, but our preliminary analysis of results reveal that numbers are truly shocking. tens of millions of birds are killed annually, if not more. Mist nets also remain a huge issue, particularly in Indo-Burma, which makes it really easy to trap birds at large industrial scales. Next steps are to work with governments to regulate hunting, working closely with communities to establish community-managed and other sustainable mechanisms. But then to tackle killing at such large scales across 10 different countries is a huge issue, and we need to scale up our efforts. With that, I will pass it over to Adi to talk about parrots and songbirds. Adi, please.
Thank you, Anuj. I will now continue with sections about parrots. And I am Adi from Burung Indonesia, one of the most significant bird inflicted by trade in Indonesia, with the majority are sourced from the eastern part of the country, concentrated in the islands of Maluku and Papua. So Burung Indonesia has conducted a number of studies on parrot trade in the islands of North Maluku, and they show that poaching and trade is still active until today. Our latest study, carried out in 2018, has revealed that the volume of parrot hunting and trade weren't actually going down. A number of parrot species are impacted by hunting and trade, largely the supply foreign demand, such as the white cockatoo, chattering lory, cactus parrot, violet-necked parrot, etc. But however, historically, the white cockatoo and chattering lory tend to be the most traded species in the black market, and so make the population in the wild have now reduced to 20% from the baseline in 1990s. The next member of cockatoo family that is struggling to survive in the wild habitat is the citron-crested cockatoo. So the species known as the subspecies of yellow-crested cockatoo with natural distribution in Sumba Island. The species has been heavily hunted for trade as pet back in 1990s, and its wild population have severely depleted due to illegal hunting and habitat loss. Well, thank God, through consistent community awareness and law enforcement efforts, trade and hunting was stopped in the late 2000s. Well, the other cockatoo that is subject to hunting for trade is salmon-crested cockatoo, or the Seram cockatoo. The species is endemic to Seram Island in the southern Maluku, but is still hunted until today, along with the other Maluku parrots, such as the red lory, leading to population declines in the last 20 years. Now we are looking at the Indonesian parrot trade map. Throughout 2 decades of our work on parrots, Burung Indonesia has mapped the parrot trade routes within Indonesia and neighboring countries. In North Maluku, for example, most parrots were captured from the forest by local hunters who have mastered the skills from their years of experience, the skills that were mostly passed on following family ties. And in light of legal consequences and increasing concern from the public, parrot trapping is now a job that hardly chosen by everyone. So today hunters are mostly those who were active since 2 decades ago. And when they are retired from the activity, they will normally be replaced by the younger in the family. We have also identified local traders in each sub-districts where parrots normally captured from nearby villages. Local hunters normally sell the birds to local traders who mostly use boats and vessels then to move parrots within and between islands. Now, parrot shipping has become more stricter in airports and big seaports. However, there are numerous smaller ports and docks in North Maluku, and they aren't always monitored by authorities, so making them easy access points by smugglers. Then the district traders are directly involved, or they work with bigger dealers in the more secretive method of transporting birds. The birds are then sold to bigger traders in various cities of eastern Indonesia, such as Manado, Ambon, Tobelo, up to Makassar and Surabaya in Java. From where the birds are normally forwarded to Jakarta, Singapore before meeting the final buyer, or further traded internationally, sometimes shipped as legal items. And let's take a look at the case in North Maluku. Parrot trapping has taken place in nearly all regions, from the north in Morotai down to Halmahera and the southern small islands of Obi and Bacan. Hunters are still active until today, and local traders are well connected with the market network. Although the legal status of the birds are commonly known among the actors, trapping and trade, triggered by ever-increasing price, remains high, especially when there is no enforcement takes place. In places where severe operation was done before, deterrent effect lasts for years, especially when there is an on-the-ground presence of local enforcer or nature conservation agency. However, in more remote areas, such as in the most areas of eastern Halmahera and southern Halmahera, as well as North Halmahera, those areas are still making the safe haven for parrot poachers. Well, working in Wallacea over the years and recently through CEPF, the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, have made us engage in this issue right from the beginning. Our series of campaign and advocacy efforts, along with the other NGOs nationally, have supported the inclusion of Indonesian parrots into the list of protected species in 2018. In North Maluku, we have been supporting investigations and law enforcement, including building consensus on parrot action plan in Wallacea. At the grassroots level, we have also raised community awareness about the value of biodiversity, introduced alternative livelihoods through sustainable agriculture. So we have seen that our on-the-ground presence has led to reduced parrot poaching, at least in villages where we are active in the past or now. In Sumba Island, with very low forest cover, the forest areas in the southern side of central to eastern Sumba are among the last remaining natural habitat for citron crested cockatoo. They were then declared as two protected areas, but then merged as one, the Matalawa National Park. The establishment of those national parks provide refuge to the cockatoo, which was under severe hunting in the 1990s. Alongside the establishment of national parks, there were also concerted efforts involving park management, police, law enforcers, including local government and parliament, aimed at saving the species from massive exploitation. Until finally hunting and trade was observed to completely cease in the late 2000s. There was a hope that the population will thrive. However, years of observation by Burung Indonesia have not shown significant increase in population, despite limited or no further hunting taking place for several years. Now our efforts have recently focused on studying the breeding ecology of the species to understand the natural and non-natural barriers to the population growth. Honestly, have also been stretched resource-wise in Sumba. However, there is revealed evidence and growing concern of new hunting activities for the species in several forest areas, including the national park. So we need to scale up our program once again in Sumba. Seems like a huge trouble. Luckily, we are not alone. Not just with our local partners, but also with BirdLife International and its national partners in Southeast Asia, like the Hariban Foundation in the Philippines. We are working together to secure the last habitat and population of parrots. It is using the power of partnership to enable tackling the issue at both the source, transit, and demand sides. Looking at the demand sides, we choose Singapore. This is one of the transit hubs and a major destination for parrot trade. Singapore is representative of other demand centers, typically wealthier and well-connected cities. In Singapore, BirdLife partnerships efforts have included mapping the extent of trade in wild-caught birds, and through awareness raising to change people's mindset towards keeping captive bred parrots. We have also developed recommendations on how to improve ringing and tracking of birds, so parrot owners can trace the source of their birds. And now we are moving to songbird trade. Well, for Indonesians, especially those living in Java or other major cities of the country, songbirds are, to be honest, the most real conservation issues right within our society. It's there in our front yards, in public courts, and in our town squares. Yes, it is very obvious. Yet, cultural discourse, economic worth, and many other arguments continue to complicate the problem, making it not a simple case to solve by the government. However, although the business is of high economic worth and employs thousands of people, it simply exterminates many species in the wild, which is worth way more than just for fun and beauty. But the previous slides have all the explanations, not to mention the species' irreplaceable ecological value for the seed dispersal and production of our food. This long enduring pastime has no doubt put many songbird species on the brink of extinction. Well, the four birds pictured here are just to represent the larger list of 43 passerine birds currently under threats of hunting, trade, and keeping in Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries. Some species, such as the straw-headed bulbul, have even lost its local populations due to long history of hunting. Domestic scarcity has unfortunately even triggered further imports from outside Indonesia to mainly western part of Java to satisfy the ever-growing enthusiasm. So there is another problem. New species such as the white eyes and the sunbirds continue to be new favorites to songbirds enthusiasts. There is also positive development here with the keeping of lovebirds, which almost all are captive bred. The keeping of lovebirds has increased in Java, partly because they hardly get the wild-caught species lately. The crisis has come to the attention of major organizations focusing in songbird, and this conservation strategy was developed in 2015. A Nation Songbirds in Trade Specialist Group was also formed shortly after. Focuses on various aspects such as the field research and genetics, conservation breeding, trade and policy advocacy, and community engagement. Well, Burung Indonesia support this songbird conservation, among others, is working with the government to strengthen the protection and management of potentially new and extended protected areas in Western Java. One of the main goals is to secure viable habitat for the Java's endemic biodiversity, including songbirds. We have conducted extensive research with Manchester Metropolitan University in 9 mountainous forests of Java, with potential to prioritize currently unprotected habitat as new protected areas. Also at the downstream where more complications are, we are engaging with actors with different roles and competence in the supply chain for a behavior change, towards zero wild-caught songbirds in trade. This, of course, needs capacity building, market-led mechanism, and a proper regulatory framework. At the same time, we also work to organize public engagement and education across various segments of the society to promote more responsible and sustainable activities such as bird watching in the wild. And that is my last slide. So thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Adi. That was a really interesting presentation, and also to Anuj. So just a reminder of BirdLife's strategy, our response to this really important issue that's threatening many birds with extinction in the Asia region. Our approach to protecting sites and establishing safe havens, important scientific work we're doing. Anuj talked about the situation analysis that we're undertaking on the illegal killing of birds, the work we're doing with organizations like Traffic to understand better and intervene in relation to the supply chain. And lastly, that long-term agenda of changing behavior and reducing demand for wild-caught birds. So this campaign is a very high priority for BirdLife at the moment, and we have a appeal that is open. We have a situation where any donations made today will be matched by donors of BirdLife. You have the opportunity of doubling your contribution. So do consider whether you might be able to support us today or at some point in the very near future. So I'm going to hand over to Patricia now. I think she has been taking note of the questions, and she's going to pose those questions to the panel. So over to you, Patricia.
Thank you. There's loads of questions. Thank you so much for all your interest. I've been trying to group them, and we will try to get to as many of those throughout this session. So let's start with COVID, guys. There are two combined questions. One, are we using COVID and human transmission in general to reinforce our conservation work? And have you seen poaching and trading of birds increasing or decreasing during the COVID pandemic? So can I go to Richard first and then perhaps Anuj?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. We do have an opportunity now to, in this terrible crisis, we do have an opportunity to raise the issue of trade in wildlife. It is so much higher up the global agenda. It's an issue that now has the attention of decision makers, policy makers, law enforcement agencies in a way that hasn't been the case before. So we are seeing now that this is an issue that is now being considered, at the very highest of levels, and we have to take this opportunity to press for four things, I think. One is that trade has to be legal. We need to stamp out illegal trade. Trade also has to be sustainable. We mustn't threaten wildlife populations. It needs to be regulated and enforced. And most importantly, it needs to be hygienic. We need to be so much more careful in how we are handling wildlife and the way in which wildlife are being mixed, brought together in wild animal markets, so often illegal markets. So we do have the issue very high on the agenda, and BirdLife is going to be pressing very hard on that issue directly with governments and through international agreements like the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And we're ramping up our campaigning and also our scientific understanding of the situation. In terms of the changes on the ground, I think perhaps Adi would be a good person to respond to that. Adi, are you seeing an increase in the trapping and trading of birds in the current economic and humanitarian crisis?
Yeah, in this period, actually, we have limitation to record maximally or optimally the trend, because of the situation where many of the rangers and also the conservation workers are put to restriction on the social distancing. But we still document that, well, there is a positive side that some species were used to be rarely appear in the mountainous forest in Western Java, are spotted by some locals and rangers. But also in the field in North Maluku, it is also reported that there is incidents of local poachers spotted carrying birds, but not that frequent. Yeah.
Thanks, Adi.
Thank you.
I hear from other parts of the world that there has been an increase in poaching and encroachment into natural habitats brought about by many hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people moving back into the countryside. So I think there is an increased pressure on nature at this time. Back to you, Patricia.
Yeah. Great, guys. Thank you so much. There have been a series of questions about how we managing demand reduction, and then we'll go into the legal elements. But if you guys can tell us both how are we thinking about tackling the demand reduction, the role of education, how are we working around demand? Anuj, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. So first of all, I must admit that demand reduction is a relatively new area of work in general for many conservation organizations. Because traditionally we've all been working in the jungles that we love and saving species, which we are good at. And only recently we've come to realize that we cannot solve this issue without working with people and reducing demand. That said, for Helmeted Hornbill, for example, we have now set up a demand reduction subgroup within the larger working group, and are really studying the different options along with key organizations, independent researchers, and traffic. So the approach is to profile the consumers and understand who's really buying, why, and what messages might appeal to them, and then craft very careful, targeted messages. If poorly done, we risk unknowingly raising demand and making these species even more fashionable. So we have to be really, really careful that we do this right and don't rush into it. So slower progress, but definitely lots of work that needs to be done on helmeted hornbills particularly.
So let's talk about the legal element. There are a couple of really interesting questions. One about the fact that the regulation is present, and despite of the fact that the regulation is there, trade and poaching is still happening. How can we go about that? And also, do we have multilateral organizations, or in particular, one question was talking about U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the United States supporting, making sure that we have the right regulations and the regulations are being enforced.
Shall I come in, Patricia, as a general response, and then maybe Adi more specifically? So I think it is worth just stressing that legal protection, it does make a difference. It does mean that you stand a good chance of bringing to an end the open, large volume trade. So it's an important step, but as the question implies, it can't be the only step. So alongside that, you do need enforcement. you do need to work with communities, particularly in terms of alternative livelihoods, in terms of raising awareness. You need to work with local civil society, those individuals and organizations in the field that are the eyes and ears and are better placed to respond if illegal activities are carrying out. And then as we've heard, ultimately you've got to bring about a change in attitude towards birds and a reduction in demand that way. So that's the sort of general response. It's multi-dimensional. All aspects are essential. But maybe Adi can talk specifically about how we've gone about tackling this in Indonesia.
Yeah, in Indonesia, for the case of parrots, then all the parrots have been protected effectively since 2018. After a very long effort to secure legal protection for the species, and its law enforcement also takes place, well, in some places are quite effective, although in remote areas there are still so many gaps left for us to improve. Today, it is much easier to enforce the law regarding parrot trade compared to like 5-10 years ago, where the law or the measure was being started to be introduced. The same situation happens for songbird at the moment. Although many of the songbirds are under protection or there is no quota for trapping and trading, but there is still happening. And the imports of songbirds from other countries or other islands to Java is still happening until today, although there is actually breaking the law. But the situation with songbirds today, like I described, is more or less like for the parrots law enforcement back in 10 years ago. So it still is seen as something strange and new. And especially because the habit of keeping songbirds is already ingrained culturally, although today, what happened today is no longer a cultural thing. It is more economically motivated for competing in songbird competition to get the money prize. That's make up the most motivation for today's songbird keeping. So I believe that legal measure is one of the effective measures to be put in place alongside the other measures like public education, engagement of the breeders, making the market solution works for changing the behavior from wild-caught birds to the captive bred. They should be complementing each other, and just to make a note that this won't be achieved in 2, 3, probably needs 5 to 10 years to be fully effective.
Yeah. Thank you, Adi and Richard. I'm going to jump into a question that we have about mist nets, but I'm also going to respond it because I just got internal information from our team. So the question was, why are we not putting more effort on controlling the trade of mist nets that are part of the tools that are being used for trading, for capturing birds? And I just got a response, Terry. I know that there's another person asking about spoonbill sandpiper there. So the question on restriction and regulation of mist net use was actually raised at the CMS COP back in February in India. And a mandate came from the CMS resolution to carry out a global review of mist net use, sales, and regulation. This is a review that we would like to carry out in partnership with others, and that we're looking to raise funds to take this step, which will help us prioritize the most effective actions in the places where it will be most effective to reduce the impact on birds. Mist net taking, sorry. So I will go back into a very interesting and complicated question, and I'm afraid that's probably the last one that we're going to take right now because of the time. Is BirdLife looking at stopping completely bird trade, or are we actually aiming for sustainable trade? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take it, Patricia. Our position at the moment is that we wish to see illegal trade brought to an end. We wish to ensure that any trade that is unsustainable is brought to an end, that there is adequate enforcement and regulations that are implemented, and most importantly, as I said earlier, that any transport, any keeping of birds is hygienic. It doesn't threaten human health. That's our view at the moment, and that is in recognition of the deep-rooted cultural appreciation and keeping of birds, and it's in recognition that there are significant livelihood interests involved here. We can't completely be dismissive of the economic dimension to this, but that said, we have a very clear agenda. We're pushing on those fronts, and we will make a huge difference. I mean, I just want to pick up on something that Adi said earlier. When I first went to Eastern Indonesia in 1997, there were birds in cages along the streets, there were birds in cages at the ports, there were birds in cages at the airports. When I went back at the end of last year, I didn't see any being openly sold. Now it's been driven underground, but at smaller numbers, and a huge difference has been made. So that's our agenda. That will be our focus, and we will make a difference.
Thank you. Anyone who wants to add one last point before we have to close?
Yeah, just to complete what Richard has just said, that I personally would love to see our society without them keeping birds in cage, but that would be hard to achieve within 1 or 2 years. We can expect for the younger generations, like those who are in junior high school or even in the elementary school, to be adopting that kind of positive behavior. But for the today's adults, the only realistic measure is to change their behavior. And that is, I think, one of the focus of Burung Indonesia in tackling the issues of wild-caught songbirds, by changing the behavior from keeping the wild-caught birds to the captive bred.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anuj, last wisdom?
No, I completely agree. On illegal killing of birds for food, I think it's equally a livelihoods issue. And I think the only way to progress there is to establish community managed areas, because communities know best and they have to see what is sustainable and what is legal. So when it's backed by governments and communities, I think that's where we're heading.
I just wanted to close by thanking all of you for you who have joined. We had almost 400 people joining live. Thanks so much for your extraordinary questions. We will try to follow up with some of them. Thanks so much for your interest. Thanks so much for wanting to share the information of these webinars. Please know that the recording of this webinar is going to be available to you through our website, so pass it on to your networks. We want more people educated about the trade of birds in Asia so we can stop it together. But if we want to stop it together, we have to raise the funding that it allows ourselves and our partners like Adi, Burung, and the rest of the partners in Asia to stop the trade. I have an extraordinary piece of news, and that is that we have £50,000 pledged as a match. So that means that if you or your friends or your family donate to our campaign, it will be matched 1-to-1 up to the point where we reach £100,000. So please go ahead and help us out with your support. There was a question asking about what can we do, what is the day-to-day, and I have a task and homework for you. First of all, if you can join us in this campaign, help us make this happen. But But second of all, and perhaps more importantly, talk to your networks, talk to your friends, talk to the people that you know. Tell them about the dire situation of birds in Asia, the impact that trade is having, and how can you make a difference by joining and supporting BirdLife and our BirdLife partners in Asia to make sure that we can make sure that our birds are going to continue to thrive in their forests for the long run. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks so much for all your interest. Stay tuned. This is the first of our conservation series. The next webinar we have is next Thursday, July the 30th, where we will have our second webinar on the green recovery. It will be about the response from the private sector to the green recovery. I'm very pleased to say that we have an excellent panel of 4 people, including the World Economic Forum, Roche, the pharmaceutical in Switzerland, the Development Bank of Singapore, and Walmart will be represented by high executives from their organizations sitting down with me and talking about the role of the private sector in the green recovery. And then in August, we will have another conservation webinar about forests. So stay tuned. I cannot even speak anymore. Stay tuned. Be aware that we are trying to make our information more available to you. We are delighted to have so many of you, and thank you so much for joining us today.